Welcome to Challenging Mental Models and Exploring Possibilities in the Settlement Sector. My name is Api. I'm from Arisa, and I'll be your host today. Innovating for Impact I2 project aims to improve the capacity of people working in Francophone and Anglophone IRCC-funded agencies to conduct social research and design through a participative, experiential learning approach to foster a sense of belonging among newcomers. This workshop will explore how we challenged mental models with our cohort and supported them in exploring possibilities, testing, and learning about new ideas in the real world. We will share and apply some of the tools and approaches used in the project to support participants in understanding the challenges and opportunities of a capacity building project that aims to shift perceptions. Your presenters are Elisama Meneses from Inspiring Communities. Elisama has more than a decade of experience working at the intersection of environmental and social justice with international organizations in Brazil, in the US, Canada, and France. Born and raised in Brazil, Elisama is a shaper, a community builder who has worked towards solutions for people and the environment through a social justice approach. Elisama is currently co-leading the Innovating for Impact project, supporting representatives from the settlement sector to unlock their innovative potential and better serve newcomers. Then your second presenter today will be Sarah Bateman from Blue Castle Consulting. Sarah has more than 15 years in public and corporate community investment, working closely with the nonprofit sector. Sarah brings a broad perspective of the philanthropic and social sector organizational challenges and opportunities. As a graduate from a social innovation graduate program at the University of Waterloo, her consultancy practice works with clients to develop emergent strategies for system change and social impact evaluation frameworks. With a focus on developmental evaluation and social innovation tools, she brings an adaptive strategy and systems lens to the work and to her work. I also want to mention to you that at the end, there will be a Q&A session. So feel free to submit your questions in writing in the Q&A Zoom feature down below at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, I will leave the floor to Elisama. Eli?
Thank you, Api. Thank you so much for this introduction. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. And Api has just mentioned the Q&A chat, but we also have the chat open for this workshop. And I will invite you to use and abuse of the chat function to share with us your reaction and feelings. To start to warm up, I would love to hear your name, where you are connecting from, and in one word, what you're hoping to get from this session. So if you can start using the chat to share that with us, that would be awesome. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land this project and the team, and most of the team in this project is located in. We are in Chibuktuk in Mi'kmaq, the traditional and unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. Land we share thanks to the treaties of peace and friendship. Acknowledge traditional or ancestral territory is one way I choose to show respect for and honor our shared treaty relationship. I am fully aware that land acknowledgement is not reconciliation. It is up to each of us to consider the ways a legacy of colonization has contributed to a present privilege and reality, whether as people who were born in this country or those who have immigrated to this place. We should all be familiar with our history, of the racist and inhumane ways our ancestors or those who lived here before us acted. I feel we should know the outcomes of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we should be familiarized with the 94 calls to action resulting from it. We should be aware of and actively work to mitigate the ongoing harms caused by colonialism, including the tragedies of lives lost and damage inflicted by the residential school system and the heartbreak of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I acknowledge this land for myself and for all the settlers people to remind us to be present in these relationships, to show up with gratitude and to be willing to learn new ways to relate. In addition, I wish to acknowledge that this region where I am in right now has a number of traditional Black and African Nova Scotia communities with deep roots and long ancestry. The effects of colonialism and the colonizer mindset have caused generational harm to Atlantic Canadians of African descent as well. We have failed to embrace and acknowledge the value of our fellow citizens, the richness they have added to our provinces culturally, economically, and historically. So now I want to walk you through our agenda. So we start with some concepts. So before we can challenge mental models, let us understand what mental model is. And then part 2, we're going to look at tools. So because of the time we have today, we're just going to explore one tool that will be used to challenge mental models. Then we're going to apply it in the context of the settlement sector. And the last part, I'll pass it over to Sarah, who will take us through a development evaluation of the measures. So to start with, I would love to hear from you. So use the chat at the bottom to tell me what comes to your mind when you think about mental models. I love that you shared where you're coming from. Just open the chat now. That's awesome. Toronto is in the house. Awesome. Love to hear about some progressive ideas to bring the settlement sector to speed with our current developments. That's beautiful. Knowledge, how people think. Awesome. Yeah, I think we are all on the same page. Please keep reacting. I love to see that you're all here. But if I could define mental models in a simple way, I would say that it's a set of beliefs and frameworks through which we make sense of the world. The name mental models is a term for any sort of concept, framework, or worldview that we carry around in your mind. So when we are exposing ourselves in the world, we use mental models to basically make sense of what we see. And these mental models help us understand life and guide our perception behavior. They are basically the thinking tools that we use to make decisions and solve problems. When you learn a new mental model, that gives you a new tool to look at a circumstance or a problem in a different way. There are many mental models. There is no perfect mental models, but when we look at models such as from physics or engineering, these mental models, they have profound impact in how we live nowadays, and they are responsible to support us in building bridges and roads, develop new technologies, and even helping us travel to outer space. I love analogies, and every time I think about a concept, I try to bring analogy to kind of ground us in that concept. And when I think about mental models, the analogy that I like is the one that connects mental models with maps of the world in our heads. So there are different maps that we have about the world in our heads, and that's what we use to navigate our lives and everything that we have. We can use a mental model knowing that we are using it, or can be something that's just intuitively done. You are not realizing you use a mental model, but you are doing it. And it can be as simple as a metaphor or something as complex as a networked system of thinking. So it can be, something that gets you to build a bridge, or it can be something that just guides a decision that you're making about, if you're going to buy a dress or not. To give an example of a mental model that's very simple is, the idea, let's say, that some people believe that left-handers are more creative than right-handers, or that boys are better at mathematics than girls. And these are incorrect and not based in any scientific research in any reality, but still some of us will use these statements to guide our approach to reality or decision that we are making. So to summarize, I would say mental models are maps that we use to inform us, and through that information, make decisions about the real world. So let's look at some examples. And here I have some of the most used mental models in universal mental models. And among them, you have learn how to learn, meta tool usage and creation, goal settings, cause and effect, prioritization, compound interest, behavior change, cognitive bias, network building, problem solving, scientific method, opportunity, and learn how to learn. By quickly checking these mental models, I would love to hear from you if you have heard about any of these models before, or if you are familiarized with any of them. We will take a quick look. We have people from BC as well. That's awesome. We'll take a quick look in the next slide about, what's up with mental models. If it sounds so good, what is the problem? But I would love to hear from you if you have heard about any of these mental models before. One that I'm kind of familiarized with is the compound interest, I guess, especially now with the economy as it is. We hear a lot about how to make your money work for you. So compound interest is definitely something that I'm familiarized with, in the scientific method for sure. That's a mental model that I have used and I use a lot, and I guess many of us as well. Well, to add to a reflection point here, while you think about what mental models you use, I just described mental models as something that we use to support us building technology, bridge. This is a map to navigate the world. Can be simple, can be complex. So if mental models help us so much, what is the issue with it? So what do you think is the issue with mental models based on what I have shared so far? I'll give you a minute while I drink some water to hear from you. So use the chat below to tell us what you think is the problem with the mental models based on what we just saw in this last couple of slides. Alma is sharing with us that they may create bias if something is taken as the word and it's not challenged. Beautiful. I could not have said it better. This is a very precise way of putting it. And I want to actually take your comment and look at the example we have here for cognitive bias. So, of course, the way our brain function is to store information as we receive it. And this is extremely important for us. And, we cannot just have a brain of a baby because we have stored many information throughout our lives. And what our brain does to be capable of storing so much information and to support us survive is to hack itself. So instead of storing the information, the brain is actually storing patterns. So it's storing compacted information and shaping it and making it easy to access, basically boxing the reality in a way that you can identify patterns within that reality instead of the information itself. So when you look at the cognitive bias below here, one thing we can identify with this specific model is that it is a very powerful tool in our mind to have bias, right? Because it helps us store tons of information in an easy to access and efficient way. So when you look at an animal, you have this bias of being able to store the information about that animal quite quickly as something to perceive as danger or not. Is it a mammal or bird? Like all of these are bias that we have that we just group information in a way that's easy for us to understand. However, the same tool can lead us, as mentioned by Alma, to taking rational decisions based on stored data that doesn't really reflect reality. And once we understand and counteract this bias, we can make better decisions. For instance, when we look at, when you look at the cognitive bias here, we see the dualism of liking, disliking, love, hating, reward and punishment. And for most things in life, or perhaps everything in life, there is not such extremes. Everything exists in a spectrum. And because our brain is going straight to the cognitive bias, it's kind of losing what is in between love and hate, liking, disliking, punishment and reward. So these boxes that are created, they create also kind of like antagonism. So you deal with similarities and opposition, and in between, there is really nothing there. And that's why mental models can be extremely dangerous, because in reality, we have the nuances, the shades in between these two boxes that our brain is just not capturing, because it's working with the mental models to help you connect and make decisions and make statements and have opinions without really unpacking it. So now that we understand, now we got a generic understanding in this last, I would say, 10 minutes of mental models, and we understand the benefits, but also the challenge that exists with it. Let's think about ways to challenge it. And why would we want to challenge it? Because we want to make decisions that really are connected with the complexity of the reality we're dealing with. Especially in the settlement sector, we are dealing with a diverse, like a sea of realities. And if we are not able to have tools to support us in unpacking this complexity, we can end up making decisions that are just in the dualism, in the very extreme of things and situations, and not really looking into the spectrum that exists in between whatever is that you are looking at. So there are many tools that you can use to challenge mental models. For this workshop, we'll be diving into the iceberg model. I really like this model because it's very simple, so anyone can understand it. And to be really honest, it's very relatable right now. Winter in Canada, everything is icy and cold. So you say iceberg and people kind of get it. So what we're going to do is to first have an overall understanding of this model. Then we're going to get into each one of these layers. And we're going to apply it with an example. So we can not only leave this space with knowing the model, but understand how we could apply it. So what the iceberg model does is to help us unpack how we see and how we react to situations in the world. Since mental models are used to frame and make sense of the world, iceberg models will help us understand at what level of complexity we are actually approaching that situation. So back to my analogy about mental models as maps, I would say that if mental models are maps, iceberg models are magnifying glasses that you use to capture the nuances and details of what you see. So you use mental models to navigate, you use your mental models to navigate the world, but the iceberg model will support you in looking at what you were missing by just leaving, the complexity of the reality outside of your understanding and just act with the models you have. So let's unpack the iceberg model. The first thing we have at the very shallow part is the events. And events will lead to reaction. That's how we could summarize this piece. And what I mean by that is that if we only look at what happened, the event itself, the best you can do is to react to it. And most of the times we want to fix it. So our reaction is always towards avoiding the problem and fixing it. This is typically the response all of us will have. And it will not shift our way of thinking, because what we do is in our response, we just use pre-existing solutions that have worked in the past. And of course, for some situations, you want to do this. If you hear an alarm that there is a fire, please don't unpack this. Just run, react, run to the first exit you're going to find and react to that situation. So looking at events and reacting to it, it is important in certain situations. But if you always apply it for every single situation you encounter, what you're going to do is to perhaps fail in address the problem you're actually dealing with, because you are not really treating that situation problem with the complexity it has. You are not looking into the systemic issues related to it. You are just dealing with the symptoms of the problem, but not really getting into the layers that shape that problem. So if you want to go deeper, we're going to get into the partners and anticipation. The partners and anticipation, it's when we start to note something that happens quite often. And then because we are noticing it, we can anticipate when it's going to happen, and then we can plan for it. And when we start to notice it, we can begin to consider what is causing the same event to happen over and over again. So if you have a headache and you start to notice that you have headaches when you don't have coffee, then you can start to anticipate you have a headache when you don't have your coffee in the morning. And by doing so, then you can plan ahead and make sure that you're going to have your coffee before you need, to have a meeting or something like that, because you don't want to show up with a headache. So that gives you a little bit more of power to anticipate, but still, you are not really unpacking the problem. You are able to identify when it's going to happen, perhaps how it happens, but you are not really dealing with the roots of the problem. Then you go to the structure. And the structure, when you look at the structure, they will allow you to take a look at the design of the problem or situation you're dealing with. And this is when we start to look at the underlying structure. And when we start to look at it, we start to be able to make changes that can actually have a more long-term, more effective response in the system or problem we're dealing with. At this stage, we are no longer at the mercy of the system. We begin to identify the thinking and the mental models that are resulting in those structures that shape the form of what we see, of what we're dealing with. For instance, if you were such looking into, let's say, a problem with language and access to language courses with newcomers, if you're looking into the system that is allowing or not allowing this to happen, and for instance, getting outside of even the newcomer spectrum and looking at everyone in that community who do not have access to language, then you start to identify that access to language is not only exclusive of newcomers, but it's a community issue. It can be a community effort to actually support it. Then you can start to decentralize the approach, and you start to be more inclusive of everyone who needs access to language to be part of that process. Finally, mental models, and that is when we get into the transformation. Changing the model of anything is the highest leverage point we can get, because it can lead to real transformation with the possibility of totally restructuring the systems and overcoming great challenges. It is possible, though, that events will lead to change in behavior and will lead to change in models, but it's not often. For instance, when you look at the unfortunate case of George Floyd that was murdered by cops, that was an event that happened and led to change in behavior, led to new relationships being formed, and some functions in the system had to be reconsidered. But this is an event that happened and changed a couple of things deeper in the system. But often what we see is the opposite, a change in the model that will change the entire system. So I want you to really look how mental models are so deeply rooted in our minds and our ways of being that is the last layer we can get. And when you go through the iceberg model, any other tool that you're going to use, that's actually the very bottom of the situation is the mental models. And even though it's the hardest to unpack, it's the one that offers the most meaningful change you can get, because it's really addressing the root cause of the problem. I have an example here for the use of the iceberg model in social innovation. This is basically looking at housing security, but I'm looking at time, and I think what I'm going to do is allow you to look at the presentation that you're going to have access to online, and you can just see how, with this specific example of housing security, this iceberg model was applied. And what we do is invite you to practice with me the application of this model in the context of the settlement sector. So what we're going to do now is take the iceberg model and apply it in a situation, and looking at the event, patterns, the structure, and the models to that very specific situation in the settlement sector. I want to say that I work with an organization that is, its expertise is on the social innovation side. So you are the experts in the settlement sector, and I would hugely appreciate if you react to, how we're going to be applying this to this very specific situation using the chat, because your inputs and your expertise will be very valuable. And this is a exercise. What I'm going to be showing here is not even close to the reality or is scratching the surface of the complexity that that problem has, but it's just for us to exercise so you have an idea of how can you use the iceberg model and how it can be applied to your specific situation in the sector you are working in. Okay, so the theme we're going to be exploring is the sense of belonging among newcomers. And here you see fitting in versus belonging, because at the end, that's the reflection we're going to be bringing to this space, is that what we are doing when we think we are doing belonging, are we doing belonging or are we fitting in? And basically fitting in, and I will explore this more ahead, the definitions of these two words, but fitting in is really about adapting to the environment or the situation, and belonging is much deeper. It's about environments and situations that appreciate and embrace diversity and different ways of being. So where is fit in is really about a person changing to accommodate the system. Belonging is a system changing to accommodate different ways of being. So what we're going to be doing is to look at newcomer sense of belonging as our issue here, or basically how do we increase the newcomer sense of belonging. And at the first level here of our iceberg model, we're going to look at the event. And the event we have in front of us that we observe is that newcomers struggle to feel like they belong when they arrive in Canada. And our reaction, because remember at this level, what we do is to react. Our reaction to this problem would be, for instance, to suggest the creation of an online platform for social interaction where newcomers could meet each other. Because in the past, we created a platform for other projects. It is a pre-existing solution that worked in the past. We have seen it working, and now we think we can just apply it here because that's what we're doing, we're just reacting to it. So first thing we do here is the reaction. We create a platform, we connect newcomers to newcomers, and that is our solution for a sense of belonging. At the second layer, when we are identify patterns, what we look at is how can we anticipate that newcomers would feel like they don't belong in Canada, because we already see that most of them feeling that way. Is there anything we can put in place that anticipates it? And a reaction, or I would say a solution in this level, would be something, for instance, related to a policy that requires newcomers when arrive in Canada to learn about Canadian culture, increasing the social, cultural, and environmental understanding of the country. Again, at this level, we are not even looking at the problem. We are still anticipating the problem. So we can still, okay, I know this will happen because it has happened before. So there is an observation piece to it, but we are not really exploring the root cause of not feeling like belonging. We are just bringing something that will perhaps help us see a trend of how many newcomers arrived, got this course, and that will be our measure to say that they feel more belonging than before. Okay, so we get at the structure level. Remember, at this level, we start to not be at mercy of the system anymore. We really start to look at the models and what shapes it. And here we start to identify some of the thinking behind the belonging. And in that process, perhaps you see that belonging is not exclusive of newcomers. There are many people who were born and raised in a place and they don't feel like they belong. So by identifying it and by looking at it with a more systemic approach, you could then think about designing a solution that is decentralized. It's an approach that centers belonging in the community and not in the individual. And for instance, you could think about a program that offers peer-to-peer service to support everyone who feels like they don't belong. Of course, perhaps you'd see many of this population being composed of newcomers, but now you are not making a problem of not belonging a newcomer problem, but you're centering belonging in the community and involving everyone to be a part of this process. So again, it's getting into the system, it's getting to the thinking of what the problem is instead of the reaction or the trend that the solution could bring. And finally, here we are at the mental model level. At this stage, we are here to unlock the paradigms around belonging. As you know, some other layers, we looked at the very top of the iceberg. We are not really tackling belonging, but fitting in. As I mentioned before, fitting in is about adapting. And at the very two layers, what we did was, okay, let's create an app and put all newcomers there, and they're going to meet each other, as if the problem of belonging is a problem of, making friends or communicating with each other. And it's only related to newcomers. The second solution was, okay, let's teach them about the culture, as if the problem with belonging is a problem that newcomers are bringing, the community that are already here also has a responsibility and is also part of the solution and the problem. At the stage of the structure, we started to unpack this, and at the mental level, mental model level, we are really looking deeper into how belong requires a structural change that accommodates the diversity of ways of being and existing. And here, at this stage, our solution will be based on rethinking the values we as a society attribute to a particular behavior, and how we as individuals contribute to reinforcing what's appropriate, accepted or not. Basically, how societies build culture and build boxes that says, this is Canadian, this is not Canadian, or as we as individuals accept or reinforce behaviors as part or not of a specific culture or a specific group. So at this level, we are really shaking the system. We're really looking into the deep-rooted problem and decentralize it for a person or even a community, and looking at how it is shaped at, the mental model level, the things we believe, the maps we use to see newcomers and belonging. And to finish my session, I want to share with you what I think is one of the best definitions of fitting in, belonging, and it is from Brené Brown. She says that fitting is about assessing a situation, becoming who you need to be accepted. Whereas belonging doesn't require us to change who we are. It requires us to be who we are. So again, if our measures to support newcomers' sense of belonging is really about changing newcomers to be accepted, then we are really at the very shallow part of the iceberg. But if we are really talking about belonging as accepting who we are and therefore who the other person are, then we're going to go deeper and explore how we define things and how we shape the boxes of culture and belonging to a group or not in the way that we do. Awesome. I think that is it from me right now. Now I will pass it over to Sarah, who will talk to you about development evaluation, other measures.
Thanks, Ellie. So we kept the best part to last, in my opinion, evaluation. What I'm going to share with you is a glimpse on how we're approaching evaluation. Mental models are part of the partnership conversations that we have with Inspiring Communities and ERASA. We want to talk about the outcomes that we're hoping for or the impacts of this project, but also we're evaluating the changes that we're seeing in the participants and their organizations as they deliver services to newcomers, ultimately to increase that sense of belonging. So a little of the nuts and bolts of this project, we have cohort members that join us to learn. These cohort members are from Atlantic Canada's immigrant serving agencies, and through the Innovating for Impact program, they are learning outcome measures, social research, and design tools that will help them innovate their services in order to better serve newcomers. So what we realized is in order to really truly innovate is you have to have that mental model shift, really getting to the root or the bottom of the iceberg that Ellie just talked about. So a lot of the training that we talk about, I'm paying attention to that as an evaluator. What shifts am I seeing within the cohorts? We're looking at all different levels of complexity here, from learning, but also how are they understanding the system in which they're operating? And with any evaluation framework, there's levels of evaluation from very complex, as we look at mental model shift, to more straightforward evaluations around, hey, did somebody's skill level or capacity increase because of this? And then the other piece that we kept in mind is we have different audiences for our evaluation. The partners of this project, ARESA and Inspiring Communities, care about some things in their own internal learning and what they can use from this project for other initiatives. You've got your sector participants and organizations that are wanting to change how they're doing things and really benefit newcomers to Canada. We have the funder. This project's funded by IRCC. And we also have knowledge mobilization. We want to share what we're learning with the greater public, which is kind of like this webinar here. So I'm going to dive into a little bit of how we're trying to evaluate this. So you can kind of see that it's not just as simple as, here's your 3-step evaluation process. So Ellie, can we go to the next slide, please? So we've approached it as the project team to look at it as learning and adapting as our evaluation goals. We have some other goals too, but we really want to see how we can improve the delivery of this learning and to be able to challenge our own mental models of what's working and what's not, and to not take anything as, oh, this is the way it has to be. We have done 2 cohorts. The first cohort was in a 10-week weekly sessions of learning and training. And then we learned a lot from that. And we shifted almost 180 degrees to our second cohort, where we did in-person instead of online training, and tried different ways to engage. And the conversations we had in the in-person, we could see the shifts in mental models, people coming in and saying, hey, I'm only operating at that event level in an iceberg, and where I want to intervene is further down. So those are the things we're keeping in mind as we're looking at the evaluation. As the teams progress when they do the learning with us, they are going to go and take their prototype out into the world and test out their theories and innovations. And we're paying attention as an evaluator and as the project team of what their aha moments are, where they've identified where they're intervening in the system based on that iceberg model. They're telling us how they're seeing the problem, not the problem, or the opportunity, however you want to frame it. So even that right there is a mental model. Is this a problem or an opportunity? So, while we're paying attention to these mental model shifts, both for us internally as a team and partnership, Inspiring Communities and ARESA, we're also paying attention to it to the participants. But then here's some other questions that we are paying attention to. How is the team learning about delivery within the immigrant serving sector? What works? How are we learning? Ellie used the example of fitting in versus belonging in our first cohort. This was a big aha. I think a lot of times immigrant services are focused on just having people assimilate, fit into Canadian culture, whereas there is so much more opportunity when it's actually more around belonging and being accepted as they are. The other piece we're paying attention to is, where does each cohort come in as? Can we meet them where they are? There is a world of difference between the first cohort and the second cohort of what they were prepared for and where their expectations were. We learned a lot about asking better questions right at the get-go, so we could understand and prepare content and help them explore their mental models more meaningfully right from the get-go. Again, I mentioned before, we're paying attention to how the participants are adapting and learning while applying these concepts in real time. I think one of the questions we saw that really kind of cheered our hearts in the last gathering of the cohort is hearing the team say, oh, but that's just at the event level. We need to go deeper into the structural mental models. And, you know, sometimes time, resources, our own energy levels prevent us from going into that mental model exploration. It is hard to tackle our biases and to really explore those when you have 1,000 other things on your plate. So we're also paying attention to what other barriers are there in place that prevent the participants from truly going into shifting some of their mental models. And the other piece is partnership dynamics at play for initiative success. So a lot of these prototypes that the cohorts are doing are across organizations. So we're also paying attention to almost those unspoken mental models of how partnerships are created and what makes a successful partnership. We're also looking at storytelling and how the cohorts are sharing how they got to their prototype or their innovation or intervention, and paying attention to some of those patterns that they're talking about as they move forward in their project. And so, you know, we just wrapped up in December our in-person cohort 2 training, and they're now just at the beginning part of their prototyping. We actually have a couple of coaching sessions with them so they can set up an evaluation framework. They can see what's shifting and learning, but also so they can journal and pay attention to what they're learning and how their mental models are shifting, either to open up opportunities or to prevent them from moving into a new space. Just thought I'd also share with you. So those are kind of some of the more complex pieces that we're paying attention to from challenging mental models and watching to see how the cohort participants are shifting, while also paying attention to their skill and capacity development within the social R&D and outcome measures. But this whole project, from an evaluation framework, I'm looking at it from different levels. The partnership is the foundation of this between Inspiring Communities and ERASA. In that partnership itself, we've had to wrestle with some really core narratives and like, what really is the purpose of this project and what are we trying to achieve, and really be able to challenge our own mental models and make sure that we're all on the same page. The process or the program design, I mentioned before, the difference between cohort 1 and cohort 2, we had to almost like throw out everything we thought would work from cohort 1 and reimagine it. If we had said, oh, that was just, you know, the spring, nobody thinks well in the spring, and we just kept everything exactly the same for the fall cohort, I think we would have seen not the level of excitement or shifts that we are starting to see from cohort 2. And then lastly, we've got the projects. So each of the cohorts are doing, there's teams in them and they're doing prototypes. And so we're doing more, I would say, formative or more traditional evaluation, but we're also asking them to embed the learning and paying attention to what's shifting for them through developmental evaluation and applying those to their projects. So again, this is not just a simple like, did they shift their mental models? Yes, no, maybe. We're looking at all different levels of how people come into space to allow their mental models to be shifted. Nobody likes to be told that they're not thinking properly or they have biases or any of those 12 mental models that Ellie talked about. So part of it is to bring people into a space of trust and conversation so that they can ask themselves the question about what's actually preventing them from going deeper and getting to true change and innovation for those they serve and for those who benefit from their programs. You know, as we move forward around the projects and the mental models, I kind of have said this a little bit before, but I'm really paying attention to over the next year what their own personal growth is of what they tell us through their own stories or journal entries, how they're shifting their narrative about where to intervene in the system, how they're seeing the impact of their prototype on newcomers, if they're seeing it just as an event, oh, it's a literacy program, full stop, or if it's going deeper into those mental models. And then we're also paying attention to the use of the tools. So, you know, Ellie showed you one of the tools that we really encourage them to use, the iceberg model. How are they using those? We've done environmental scans. We've done all sorts of, one of the teams, I gave them a tool called the advocacy framework that really shows change over time and getting to people's biases underneath if you need them to advocate for you. So there's all sorts of tools. So we're paying attention to what tools they use, because similar to this evaluation, we can have really simple evaluation of like, did you learn? To what extent did you learn? Or we can get to really complex evaluation and look at what's shifting, where are you entering the system for change. And so again, we're trying to help the cohort members also have that lens when they're doing their programs or prototypes. They could just say, hey, how many participants went to this literacy program? Or they could say, how does this literacy program actually help with sense of belonging, and have the newcomers share their experiences with it, almost like a newcomer-centered approach. What we are finding is whatever is centered, that's what gets paid attention to. So if the funder is centered, what the funder wants gets there. If the organization or partner is centered, that's what gets paid attention to. If the newcomer is centered, that's what gets paid attention to. So that's another part of the evaluation that I'm paying attention to, is in the prototypes, what gets centered. And usually when whoever is being benefited or you're trying to help is centered, you're further down in the iceberg and getting to innovation. I could talk about evaluation all day, but we've got just a couple more minutes here. I'm going to go to some of the tools. And this is just more for those of you that are evaluation nerds like me. These are some of the tools we're currently using. I've mentioned them a bit in my overview. So we have a selection of both qualitative and quantitative data, you know, in the moment sense making, learning and adapting as we go forward. And then we also have kind of the more traditional of like, what was the baseline when you came into the program? Where are you after the training? Where are you after the prototypes? And then we're going to be doing a couple of rounds of outcome harvest, which are having an evaluator ask an interview styles with the participants what really made a difference for them, and in their mind, what made the difference for the newcomers they serve. So one of the challenges we have with tools is, I think Ellie or Appy mentioned this, we are offering this program as a bilingual program. So we have both Anglophone and Francophone participants. And so to find the tools that make sense in both languages simultaneously, with simultaneous interpretation, we're also trying to figure out, does that add to the learning and mental models as somebody is translating? They might not be as familiar with some of the terms. Does that prevent people from thinking differently? We're looking at all sorts of pieces that might play into it. Or when I'm translating a Francophone's response to a survey, I'm not a French speaker, I'm learning, but what am I losing in nuance and sense making when that happens as well? So these are just some of the things and challenges within this that we're paying attention to. The other thing we're kind of worried about when we're asking them to shift their mental models or think about entering a system or change at a different level is worried that we're only giving them shallow tools or shallow entry points into some very complex issues. And so are we giving them enough that will be helpful, or is a little bit of information actually harmful? How do we keep providing resources and tools for them so they can look at it in an ethical and fuller picture approach as well? So, and we'll go to my last slide before we hand it over to Appy for questions. So here's some things that we're learning in this. We're seeing capacity in the sector in Atlantic Canada shift towards more innovative ways of doing things. We're seeing some mental model shift, like real ahas around the difference between belonging and fitting in. What we're seeing is trust is at the center of collaboration in order to progress things positively. You can put on an event, but if you're not trusting each other who are doing a big project, chances are you're probably not going to intervene at a deeper level. There's huge barriers of time, exhaustion of resources that prevent these shifts in mental models. There's limited motivation to risk and change the way things are done. That's for a variety of reasons, which we could probably do a whole webinar on right now. But a number of these agencies are funded by single funders. So, again, what's centered, where's the need is one of the questions we have. In-person sessions were more than just learning. It's around relationship and the cross-pollination of ideas. And we're holding this question right now. How do participants go deeper in their learning so it is used ethically and wisely? So again, those, I find like evaluation is mostly questions in my world. So this is a little bit of how we're approaching the evaluation for the whole project, but also paying attention to what's shifting in the mental models. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Appy, and she's going to moderate some of the questions that will that have started to pop up in the Q&A. So over to you, Appy.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Thank you actually to both of you for tackling such a difficult subject and exploring mental models in our sector. So one of the first questions that I have for you is, how are you challenging mental models with the cohorts that you have? So Ellie, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ab. That's a great question. So as Sarah mentioned, we have been using different approaches and tools. And I would say that the first thing is perhaps to take a step back and really meet them where they are at, understanding that these people, they come with expertise and understanding of not only the sector they work with, but most of our cohort participants, for instance, they have lived experience as newcomers. So we acknowledge that and try not to just dump a bunch of tool on them, but to really be aware of where they are at and what are their needs at their very specific stage. And as Sarah mentioned, walk complexity in a way that it doesn't overwhelm them, but it also doesn't stop them from wanting to dive deeper into it. So it's quite easy to be at the level of reaction at the model that we showed at the very shallow part, because it's something that we have used before. Our reactions informed by past solutions that were efficient, so we have like data to back us up, but it doesn't mean the context of what we're doing that will work well. So we're trying to understand what is the line between not burning out and overwhelm our participants and give them tools and support them in dive deeper without getting lost in the process or feeling like it's just more to them to deal with a sector that's already in crisis mode for so long. So some of the approaches is really, if I could summarize what I just said, is, as Sarah mentioned, centering the cohort and the cohort participant as the main piece of the puzzle, understanding that for that, in order for them to center newcomers, they will need support. And that's what we are doing in Outside, is centering them and designing the cohort for them and meeting them where they are at. In that way, we believe that they're going to feel not only excited about exploring the complexity of the issue, but also not overwhelmed by, the systemic traps that we can find in the process. And just to finalize, because I want to hear from Sarah as well, I want to pass to her to see her comments on that. We have a second cohort, and as Sarah mentioned, our first cohort was completely different, and that informed us as well how centering the people who we work with to design what we are doing for them, it's essential, because it completely changes depending on the group you have, the approaches you're going to use. But over to you, Sarah, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. I echo everything you say. I think, one of the things Ellie kind of alluded to it, but we're trying to demonstrate in real time with the cohorts when they ask questions, as our mental models are being shifted, watching us adapt and ask ourselves questions in real time so that they can see how that looks like in practice. But I do think that one of the biggest challenges is people want to have something really simple. And when you're looking at complexity around an issue of belonging or how to innovate and deliver services better, there's no simple ways or simple tools or silver bullets. So again, I think that idea of and Ellie's really good at this when we're doing the coaching sessions. She asks really good questions when they say, hey, this is what we're thinking about doing. And she just asks these probing questions that makes them go deeper into the complexity of it. So that's a little bit of what we're trying to do.
Thank you. And just shortly, because I want to allow time for more questions. And there is actually a question in the chat, in the Q&A chat about evaluation. But quickly, can you tell us more about the Innovating for Impact project?
Sure. Sorry, sure. Yeah, the Innovating for Impact project is a partnership between IRESA and Inspiring Communities. And this project aims to support people working in the settlement sector, especially agencies funded by IRCC and Atlantic Canada, to build capacity in social research and design and outcome measurement and development evaluation to support newcomers' sense of belonging. And it seems like how through this road of social research and design, outcome measurement, we get to newcomers' sense of belonging. And I think it's a combination of everything that Sarah and I have presented today. It's dive into complexity with the tools that can evaluate how deep you're going and what responses you are getting from it, and understanding everything else that's happening around that while you're trying to unpack complexity. Basically, it is a space that changes quite often. People are overwhelmed, are burnt out, and our goal is to giving tools to do meaningful work without adding more to the agenda or to the file. This partnership has been going on for more than a year. We are getting into the prototyping phase with our cohort, meaning that they went through training phase. It's a continuing engagement through coaching sessions, follow-up sessions, but they will get seed money to try the ideas. And the outcome of it for us is the learning process. We really want to engage with them in what they learned when they are trying to do things differently and how they see the application of that in their day-to-day lives, at the office, with the folks they're working with, etc. Yeah, I think, Sarah, if you want to add something, jump in, but I think there's a question for you.
No, I think you answered that beautifully. Thanks, Ellie.
All right. And then there is a question in the chat. I'm assuming that it's directed to you, Sarah. Who will initiate this evaluation, the agency or the funder? So, yeah.
I guess maybe I'm not sure which part of this evaluation is. So maybe I'll just talk about the different parts of the evaluation and who initiates it. So overarching for Inspiring Innovation, I'm an independent evaluator that's been hired by Inspiring Communities and IRESA to evaluate that project. So that triangle that I talked about, the 3 levels of partnership, process, and project. This project is funded by IRCC, and in the project description, when they were asking for funding, evaluation was a big part of it, because the project we're doing with IRCC is actually part of their service delivery improvement. And so they want to learn along with us. So I've been hired as an independent for that part of it. For the prototypes and the cohort participants in their evaluation, what it's part of being a participant in the Inspiring for Innovation cohort is that they'll have an evaluation framework approach as part of their prototype. So it's not just, oh, let's try this and see what happens. It's hey, what's the question we're holding? What do we want to learn? How do we want to adapt this? And so as part of that coaching piece, and part of their seed money that Ellie talked about, so we're giving them some funding. They don't have to do these prototypes and try to find money in the back pockets of everything. They are, we're giving them some seed money. And that includes funding to do evaluation. It's as part of their prototype, they have to do the evaluation. And all of that then rolls up to the project evaluation, which then we report to the funder. But the funder has given us really wide range of like, hey, what are we trying to figure out, learn and adapt? And we're doing the same thing for the cohort participants is you tell us what your question is for evaluation. So hopefully that answers the question from the webinar participant here. If not, feel free to ask it again in a different way.
I see something else. So it's do you see this as a process evaluation where you can also obtain feedback to continually improve?
Yeah, that's actually my whole approach as an evaluator is, and that's the developmental evaluation approach or utilization evaluation is around the process. So we're constantly getting input and feedback. We're constantly asking for surveys or conversations. We're taking notes. We feel like for us in the bigger project, that process is. We're also asking the cohort to look at it from that perspective too. So that's more of that developmental learn as you go. Developmental evaluation is really in complexity. You might have an idea where you're going, but you're learning and adapting as you go versus waiting to the end to change things. So we're suggesting they have that kind of lens of learning and adapting as they go forward versus just waiting to the end. Yeah, hopefully that gets to the crux of that question. There any other questions, or Ellie, do you want to answer or add anything to any of these evaluation questions?
I think there's another question that I guess,
Okay.
yeah, I will let Epi.
Yeah, there's a great question. Someone has asked, is part of this project teaching the sector to be able to conduct their own evaluations?
Yes, it's a big part of it. So the outcome measurement part of it is, from what I understand in our conversations with IRCC, is they're really trying to move to more of that outcome impact measurement piece of things, so to be able to train and build the capacity of the sector to see kind of that more complex outcomes or more complex impact that their services are providing or making change in the system. So actually we had a team from cohort, I think the last cohort, they were like, oh, well, hire an evaluation consultant. But we were like, hey, no, we want to see you do this in practice, right? Because understanding what you're trying to evaluate and then putting some of these tools into play is actually a really important piece, not just for the funders, but also for your own agency strategy. And it's, what you're finding out in evaluation, it's not just measurement, but also sense making of the data. We want them to have better skills. And it does worry me a bit, just are we giving them deep enough skills in evaluation that they can do it well and ethically? So we're constantly providing them with more resources and webinars and all sorts of things so that they can continue to learn, because I've been learning evaluation for a good chunk of my career and I still feel like a beginner. So, I don't think you ever fully know evaluation because each context is different. So
Abdul Nasser is asking, how about the physical challenges?
Is that to evaluation or to the program? Maybe get a little bit more explanation on that.
Maybe Abdul Nasser can maybe give us more details? Okay, to the program, they said.
So, Ellie, do you want to talk about that as the co-lead? Please.
Sure. Yeah. Well, physical challenge, trying to wrap my head around it. Perhaps I'll explore physical in many different ways here, but well, we have because of the scope of the project being Atlantic Canada, then we have the physical challenge of having everyone together in one place that we are able to tackle during a 2 days in-person session last year. But what we did to overcome some of the challenge is really look into a hybrid approach, identify in our project what are some of the pieces that would be valuable to have people in person building relationship and making connections, and what are other pieces that they do not really rely on being in person to be done. So what we did was to identify when, you know, participants needed to create a group, for instance, to think about an idea, to brainstorm prototype ideas and connect to each other on that. That was the in-person component. But the background information, kind of like the baseline, was done in online sessions before the in-person. If physical challenge related to perhaps the participants themselves is always back to not having only 24 hours in a day and so many things happening, right? So that's something that we are trying with the participants to understand what is the best way to innovate, again, take into consideration the workload folks already have and the change that happens in this sector. So this is an ongoing process that we are trying to figure it out together. In terms of, I'm trying all the physical challenge possible here because my mind went everywhere. As a team, we work mainly remotely, and that is no really physical challenge to that, I would say. But in general, if I would have to look at it as what could be the barriers to actually do this work in person, I think COVID have taught us to work online quite well, and the cohorts are now able to collaborate with each other, even though they are not in the same space, which in my view opens up a new door of opportunities and possibilities in the sector to collaborate, learn from each other, and become a bit more cohesive in terms of approaches to support newcomers. So I would say that the physical challenge of not being in the same place are actually an opportunity for us, using like a hybrid approach to have folks sharing more and connecting more, and kind of like knowledge mobilization across different agencies in the Atlantic Canada. I don't know if you'd approach in a different way, Sarah, but feel free to jump in if you have a different approach to physical challenge.
That would be how I would have answered it too. So hopefully that answers. Oh.
Okay, so Abdul Nasser said thank you. One last question, because we're almost getting to the end of our session today. Who are the participants in the two cohorts, and can you provide some examples of how you worked with them to challenge mental models? And I think, yeah, shortly, we have very little time left.
Yeah, I will be short on that. That's a really good question. So the participants, they were the participants for cohort 1 and cohort 2. There were a couple of things they had in common, and this is part of the criteria of the project. They had to be, they have to work for an IRCC funded agency in Atlantic Canada. So we have a scope in terms of geography and also the funding for the agencies, because this project is funded by IRCC. So in terms of the profile of folks, they were mainly people who had some sort, for cohort 1 especially, they had some sort of a position within the organization that could perhaps have a snowball effect to the whole organization, meaning that they were coordinating a team, or they had some sort of management position that could bring the knowledge that we are sharing with them here to more than just one person in the organization, share it through the team. For the second cohort, we shift a little bit from that to an approach of folks who had the profile of wanting to innovate and wanting to bring a new idea and have it funded to put it in place and prototype it. And that shift really paid off, because being in a position of managing coordinated team, there are so many layers to that, and usually those folks are the ones working the most and have so many responsibilities. And looking at folks who actually wanted to do the work, then they already arrived like full of energy and excited to do it. So there was a big shift that really helped. So all of these folks, they work in settlement agencies in Atlantic Canada. They support newcomers. So we are not working directly with newcomers. How we help them challenge mental models? Well, what you saw today at the beginning with the iceberg model, they went through a similar approach. I mean, we had more time, but we also use other tools such as environmental scan, which is a tool that helps you understand what is happening in your environment and really supports you understand the change in politics, economics, social issues, demographics that could affect your decision in your project. And this is a tool that we have been using with our cohorts and really engage them in doing it, because we believe more information you can have, then you can make decisions that will reflect what you have as information, but we will also be better at accommodating any change that are coming. So besides what you saw today, the mental model, iceberg model, we also use all the tools such as environmental scan, and that's basically a Pandora box that when you open, there are many other tools within that tool that will serve specific needs that we have. And just to close, it's really about understanding where the group is at to, Sarah and I think about what the tools they need. So it always starts with talking with the cohort and understanding their needs first, instead of just throwing a bunch of tools to help them with things they don't see a problem with.
I'm just going to add one thing. We approach this as, and this might sound, to love the problem rather than the solution is kind of how we approach it. So to really understand the system and the problem or the opportunity before jumping to a solution. And so we often saw some of the cohort members going, oh, this is my solution, before they really understood what's going on in the context and the tools that Ellie talked about. So we spent a lot of time understanding that context, love the problem, not the solution. So thank you for joining us. I'll pass it to Happy to wrap us up.
Wow, love the problem. So this is your final words, and I think this is where we're going to end this session. I don't see any more questions in the chat or in the Q&A button there. So Ellie and Sarah, do you have any final comments or, something you'd like to, leave us with?
Just thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, I don't want to thank you, Api, for being our beautiful, awesome chair, and everyone who attended today. If you have any questions, you can always email impact@areza.ca and reach out to us. We are happy to answer any further questions you have, and thank you so much for this opportunity.